The Tiger of Mysore, by G. A. Henty. Chapter 11. A Useful Friend. "I agree with you that it would be a disadvantage to go as a soldier," Dick said, after a pause, "but what disguise would you recommend us to choose?" "That I must think over. You both look too straight and active to be employed as the assistant of a trader, or I could have got some of my friends to take you in that capacity. The best disguise will be a gayer attire, such as would be worn by the retainers of some of the chiefs, and, were it not that if questioned you could not say who was your employer, that is what I should recommend." "I saw a number of men working at a battery they are erecting by the riverside. Could we not take service there until something better presents itself?" "I should not advise that," the native replied, "for the work is very hard and the pay poor. Indeed, most of those employed on it are men driven in from the country round and forced to labour, getting only enough pay to furnish them with the poorest food. There would also be the disadvantage that, if you were so employed, you would have no opportunity of seeing any English captives who may have been brought here of late. All that I can at present do, myself, is to speak to some of my friends who have been here for a long time, and ask them whether they can remember an English captive being sent up here from Coorg, some 8 years ago, and whether they ever heard what was his fate. I should say, of course, that I have received a message from friends at Conjeveram, and that some of the men's relations have sent out to make inquiries concerning him, and asking me if I can find any news as to his fate. My friends may not know themselves, but they may be able to find out from others. Very many of our people were forced into the ranks of the army, and there is not a regiment which has not some men who, although regarded as Mohammedans, are still at heart, as we all are, as true to our faith as ever. It is from these that we are more likely to obtain information than in any other way. You will not be very long before you will be able to satisfy yourself as to whether or not he whom you seek is in this city, and if he should not be here, there remain but the 2 towns that I have named, and, of course, the hill forts. As to these, it will be well nigh impossible to obtain an entrance, so jealously are they all guarded. None save the garrisons are allowed to enter. The paths, which are often so steep and difficult that men and provisions have to be slung up in baskets, are guarded day and night, and none are allowed to approach the foot of the rocks within musket shot, lest, I suppose, they might find some spot where an ascent could be made. The garrisons are seldom changed. The soldiers are allowed to take their wives and families up with them, but once there, they are as much prisoners as those in the dungeons. That is one reason why captives once sent up there never come down again, for were they to do so, they might, if by chance they escaped, be able to give information as to the approaches that would assist in an assailing force. I do not say that all are killed, though undoubtedly most of them are put to death soon after they arrive, but it may be that some are retained in confinement, either from no orders being sent for their execution, or from their very existence being in time forgotten by the tyrant here. Some of these may languish in dungeons, others may have gained the goodwill of the commanders of the fort, for even among the Mohammedans there are doubtless many good and merciful men. Now for the present. This house has but 1 story in front, but there is a room over this, and that is at your service. Furniture it has none, but I will this evening get a couple of trusses of straw. It is but a loft, but you will not want to use it, save to sleep in. You need not fear interruption in this house. There is scarce a man here that is not, like myself, a Hindu, for when we were brought here from Mysore, the piece of ground on which the street stands was assigned to us, and we were directed to build houses here. Few besides ourselves ever enter it, for those who still carry on trade have booths in the marketplace. There is one thing I will tell you at once. We, the persecuted, have means of recognizing each other. Outward signs there are none, neither caste mark nor peculiarity of dress, but we know each other by signs. When we salute, we turn in the thumbs as we raise our hands to our turbans, so. If we have no occasion to salute, as we move our hands, either to stroke our faces or to touch the handles of our daggers, or in other ways, we keep the thumb turned in. If the man be one of ourselves, he replies in the same way. Then, to prevent the possibility of error, the one asks the other a question, on what subject it matters not, providing that before he speaks he coughs slightly. You must remember that such communication is not made lightly. Were it to be so, it would soon attract notice. It is used when you want to know whether you can trust a man. It's as much as to say, "Are you a friend? Can I have confidence in you? Will you help me?" And you can see that there are many occasions on which such knowledge may be most useful, even to the saving of life. "I do indeed see it," Dick said, "and greatly are we indebted to you for telling us about it." They remained talking with their host, whose name was, he told them, Pertaub, until darkness came on. They had shared his rice with him, and had requested him to lay in such provision as was necessary for them, and as soon as it became dark they went out, leaving their guns behind them. Busy as the main streets were when they had before passed through them, they were very much more so now. The shops were all lighted up by lanterns or small lamps, and the streets were filled with troops, now dismissed from duty, and bent, some on amusement, some in purchasing small additions to their rations with the scanty pay allowed to them. In the open spaces the soldiers were crowded round performers of various kinds. Here was a juggler throwing balls and knives into the air. There was a snake charmer, a Hindu doubtless, but too old and too poor to be worth persecuting. A short distance off was an acrobat, turning and twisting himself into strange postures. Two sword players with bucklers and blunted tulwars played occasionally against each other, and offered to engage any of the bystanders. Occasionally the invitation would be accepted, but the sword players always proved too skilful for the rough soldiers, who retired discomfited amid the jeers of their comrades. More than one party of musicians played what seemed to Dick most discordant music, but which was appreciated by the soldiers, as was evident from the plaudits and the number of small coins thrown to the players. In the great open space by the side of the market the crowd was thickest. Here were large numbers of booths, gay with lamps. In one were arranged on tables trays of cheap trinkets, calicoes, cloths, blankets, shoes, and other articles of dress. In another were arms, matchlocks, pistols, tulwars, and daggers. On the ground were lines of baskets filled with grain of many kinds, the vendors squatting patiently behind them. Some of the traders volubly accosted passers-by. Others maintained a dignified silence, as if they considered the excellence of their wares need no advertisement. It was not new, but it was very amusing to Dick, and it was late before they returned to their lodging. "I wish," he said, as they strolled back, "that I were a good juggler or musician. It seems to me that it would be an excellent disguise, and we could go anywhere without question, and get admittance into all sorts of places we could not get a chance of entering into in any other way." "Yes, that would be a good thing," Surajah agreed, "but I am sure that I could not do anything, even if you could. No, I quite see that, and I am not thinking of trying, but it would have been a first-rate plan." "You are very good at sword play," Surajah suggested, although somewhat doubtfully. Dick laughed. "The first really good swordsman that came along would make an exhibition out of me. No, one would have to do something really well." The subject was renewed after they had seated themselves with Pertaub. "It would be an excellent disguise," he agreed. "A good juggler could gain admission to the palace, and might even enter forts where no others could set foot, for life there is dull indeed, and anyone who could amuse the soldiers would be certain of a welcome. Even a governor might be willing to see his feats." "Could one bribe a conjurer to let one pass as his assistant?" "Oh, that would be impossible," the Hindu said, "for an assistant would have opportunities for learning the tricks, and no money would induce a really good juggler to divulge his secrets, which have been passed down from father to son for centuries." "If one had thought of it," Dick said, "one could have bought in London very many things which would have seemed almost magical to the people here. I am afraid that we must go on, though, in our old line. It is a pity, for the other would have been a first-rate approach." "I have obtained for you this evening 2 suits of clothes such as we spoke of. In them you can pass as followers of some petty rajah, and are not likely to attract attention. I have inquired among some of my friends, and hear that the Rajah of Bor left here today with his following. He is but a petty chief, and Bor lies up north, close to the Nizam's frontier. Thus, if you should be asked in whose service you are, you will have a name to give, and there will be no fear of your being contradicted. If you are still further questioned by anyone with a right to ask, you can say that you were told to remain here in order to see how fast the drilling of the troops went on, and to send the Rajah a report when it is time for him to return here to accompany Tippoo on his march. You will, of course, account for your dialect by keeping to your present story, that you came from a village on the Ghauts in order to enter the service of one of our rajahs, and that your father having years ago been a soldier in the pay of the Rajah of Bor, you made your way there direct instead of coming to the capital." "That will do excellently, Pertaub. It was a fortunate moment indeed that brought us to your door." "I have done nothing as yet, Sahib, but I hope that in time I may be able to be of use to you. It is fortunate for me as well as for you, perhaps, that you stopped at my door. Of late I have had nothing to think of save my own grief and troubles, but now I have something to give an interest to my life, and already I feel that I need not merely drag it on until I am relieved of its burden. And now, Sahibs, I am sure that rest must be needful for you, and would recommend that you seek your beds at once." On the following morning, Pertaub brought up the garments that he had bought for them. Nothing could be more irregular than the dress of the armed retainers of an Indian rajah. All attire themselves according to their fancy. Some carry spears and shields, others matchlocks. Some wear turbans, others iron caps. The cut and colour of their garments are also varied in the extreme. Dick's dress consisted of a steel cap with a drooping plume of red horsehair, and a red tunic with a blue sash. Over it was worn a skirt of linked mail, which, with leggings fitted tightly, completed the costume. Surajah had a red turban, a jerkin of quilted leather, with iron scales fastened on to protect the shoulders and chest. A scarlet kilt hung to his knees, and his legs were enclosed in puttees, or swathes of coarse cloth, wound round and round them. He wore a blue and gold girdle. Dick laughed as he surveyed the appearance of himself and Surajah. "We are a rum-looking couple," he said, "but I have seen plenty of men just as gaudy in the train of some of the rajahs who visited the camp when we were up here. I think that it is a much better disguise than the one we wore yesterday. I shan't be afraid that the first officer we meet will ask us to what regiment we belong. There were scores of fellows lounging about in the streets last night, dressed just as we are." Sticking their swords and pistols into their girdles, they sallied out, and were pleased to find that no one paid the slightest attention to them. They remained in the town until some battalions of recruits poured out from the fort to drill on the grounds between it and the town. The first 4 that passed were, as Dick learnt from the remarks of some of the bystanders, composed entirely of boys. Some of them Christians, 30,000 of whom had been carried off by Tippoo in his raid on Travancore, and the young men were compelled to serve, after being obliged to become nominally Mohammedans. After the Chellah battalions came those of Tippoo's army. "These fellows look as if they could fight," Dick said. "They are an irregular lot, and don't seem to have an idea of keeping line or marching in step, but they are an active-looking set of fellows, and carry themselves well. As to the Chellahs, I should say they would be no good whatever, even if they could be relied on, which we know they cannot be. They look dejected and miserable, and I suppose hate all as much as their officers do. I should back half a regiment of English to lick the 12 battalions. I wonder Tippoo himself does not see that troops like these must be utterly worthless." "I don't expect he thinks they would be of much use," Surajah agreed. "He only turned them into soldiers to gratify his hatred of them." Leaving the troops, they walked on and entered the great fort, which enclosed an area of nearly 2 square miles. In this were Tippoo's palace, his storehouses, containing grain sufficient for the garrison for a siege of many months, mosques, the residences of Tippoo's officials and officers, the arsenals, and the huts for the troops. There was also a street of shops, similar to those in the town. Wandering about unquestioned, they came presently upon a scene that filled Dick with indignation and fury. 2 white officers, heavily ironed, were seated on the ground. Another, similarly ironed, lay stretched beside them. He was naked from the waist up. His back was covered with blood, and he had evidently been recently flogged, until he fell insensible. Half a dozen savage-looking men, evidently executioners of Tippoo's orders, were standing around jeering at the prisoners and refusing their entreaties to bring some water for their comrade. "You brutes," one of the captives explained in English, "I'd give all my hopes of liberty for 10 minutes face to face with you, swords in hands." "They would not be of much use to us," the other said quietly. "It's 4 days since we had a mouthful of food, and they'd make very short work of us." "All the better," the other exclaimed. "Death would be 1,000-fold preferable to this misery." Dick felt that, if he remained longer, he would be unable to contain himself, and turning hastily away, walked off, accompanied by Surajah. "It is awful," he exclaimed, with tears running down his cheeks, "and to be able to do nothing. What must Father have gone through? I think, Surajah, that if we were to come upon Tippoo I should go for him, even if he were surrounded by guards. Of course it would cost me my life. If I could kill him, I think I should not mind it. Such a villain is not fit to live, and at any rate, whoever came after him, the prisoners could not be worse off than they are now. Let us go back. I have had enough for this morning." When they returned, Dick told Pertaub of the scene that he had witnessed. "Many of them have been starved to death," the old man said. "Possibly one of their companions may have tried to escape. It is to prevent this that Tippoo's greatest cruelties are perpetrated. It is not so very difficult to get away and take to the jungle. Some have succeeded, but most of them are retaken, for a watch is vigilantly kept up at every village and every road leading on to the frontier, and if caught they are hung or forced to take poison. But whether they are caught or not, Tippoo's vengeance falls upon their companions. Those are flogged, ironed, kept without rations for weeks, living, if they do live, upon the charity of their guards. This is why there are so few attempts at escape. A man knows that, whether he himself gets off or not, he dooms his companions to torture, perhaps death. One case I remember in which an English sailor, 1 out of 9, attempted to get away. He was captured and killed at once, and his 8 companions were all hung. So, you see, even if one of the captives sees a chance of escape, he does not take it, because of the consequences that would fall upon his companions." "It is horrible," Dick said, "and I can quite understand why so few escape. The question for me now is whether there are any prisoners kept in dungeons here." "Not here, I think. Tippoo's policy is to make all his captives useful, and though one might be ironed and confined for a time, I do not think that any are so kept permanently here. There were, of course, some confined to the fort by illness, and some in irons. It may need some little search before you are quite sure that you have seen everyone. However, I will try to find out how many there are there, and to get as many of the names as possible. Some of my friends who keep shops in the fort may be able to do this for me. This would shorten your task. But I cannot hold out any hopes that you will find him whom you seek in the city. It is among the hill forts you will find him, if he be alive. I have been turning the matter over since you spoke to me last night, and the best plan I can think of is that you should go as a travelling merchant, with Surajah as your assistant. You would want a good assortment of goods, fine muslins and silks, and a good selection of silver jewellery from different parts of India. All these I could purchase for you here. If, by good luck, you could obtain a sight of the commander of one of these forts, you might possibly obtain permission from him to go up, and show your wares to the ladies of his establishment, and to those of other officers. The present of a handsome waist sash, or a silver-mounted dagger, might incline him favourably to your petition." "I think that idea is an excellent one," Dick said warmly. "If we cannot get in that way, there seems to be no chance, save by taking a careful survey of the fortress, to discover where the rocks could be most easily climbed. There must surely be some spots, even among the steepest crags, where active fellows like Surajah and myself would be able to scale them. Of course, we should have to do it after dark, but once up there, one ought to be able to move about in the fort without difficulty, as we should of course be dressed as soldiers, and could take dark blankets to wrap round us. We ought then to be able to find where any prisoners who may be there are confined. There might be a sentry at the door, or, if there were no other way, one might pounce upon someone, force him by threats to tell us what prisoners there are, and where they are confined, and then bind and gag him, and stow him away where there would be no chance of his being discovered before daylight." "There would be a terrible risk in such a matter," Pertaub said, shaking his head gravely. "No doubt there would be risk, but we came here prepared to encounter danger, and if it were well managed, I don't see why we should be found out. Even if we were, we ought to be able to slip away in the darkness, and make our way to the point where we went up. Once down on the plain, we could renew our disguise as traders, and however hotly they scoured the country, pass without suspicion through them. I think that there will be more chance in that way than in going in as traders, for we should in that case have little chance of walking about, still less of questioning anyone. However, it is worth trying that first. We can always fall back upon the other if it fails. We might, on our first visit, obtain indications that would be very useful to us in our second." Chapter 12: A Tiger in a Zenana. Another week passed, and by the end of that time Dick was perfectly assured that his father was not at Seringapatam. It was then a question of which of the hill forts to try first. Pertaub had already procured for them an assortment of goods and dresses, suitable for travelling merchants, and the purchase of these things had drawn heavily on their stock of money, although several of the traders, on receiving a hint from Pertaub of the purpose for which the goods were required, had given many articles without charge, while for the majority of the goods Dick gave an order on his mother, who had told him that he could draw up to £500. On the day before they were about to start, their plans were interrupted by the issue of a proclamation, saying that sports with wild beasts would take place on the following day, and they agreed that, as one day would make no difference, they would stop to see them, especially as Tippoo himself would be present. Hitherto, although they had several times seen him being carried in his palanquin, they had had no opportunity of observing him closely, as he was always surrounded by his guards. The sports were held in a great square in the fort. A strong network was erected in a semicircle, of which the palace formed the base. Behind the network the spectators ranged themselves. Tippoo occupied a window in the palace looking down into the square. There were always a number of wild beasts in Seringapatam available for these purposes, as a regular supply of tigers, leopards, and wild elephants was caught and sent in every month. 6 of the largest tigers were always kept in cages in the courtyard in front of the palace, and to these were thrown state criminals, or officials who had offended the tyrant, and were devoured by them. In his younger days Tippoo had been very fond of the chase, but he was now too fat and heavy, and seldom ventured on horseback. Dick and Surajah, who had arrived early, had placed themselves at the corner where the network touched the palace. Some 30 yards in front of them a balcony projected. It was enclosed by a thick lattice work. From behind this the ladies of Tippoo's harem viewed the sports. These sports began with a contest of fighting rams. The animals were placed some 50 yards apart. As soon as they saw each other, both showed extreme anger, uttering notes of defiance. Then they began to move toward each other, at first slowly but increasing in speed, until, when within a few yards of one another, each took a spring, meeting in mid-air, forehead to forehead, with a crash that could be heard far away. Both fell back and stood for a moment shaking their heads, as if half stupefied by the blow. Then they backed up 2 steps and hurled themselves at each other again. After this had been repeated once or twice, they locked forehead to forehead, and each strove to push the other back. For some time the struggle continued on equal terms. Then the weaker began to give way, and was pushed back step by step, until its strength failed altogether, and it was pushed over onto the ground, when the attendants at once interfered and separated them. Some 30 pairs of rams fought, the affair being to Dick extremely monotonous. The natives, however, took great interest in the contests, wagering freely on the issues, shouting loudly to the combatants, and raising triumphant cries when one was adjudged the victor. Then elephants were brought in, but the struggle between these was even tamer than between the rams. They pushed each other with their foreheads until one gave way, when the other would follow it, beating it with its trunk and occasionally shoving it. When this sport was over, 2 parties of men entered the arena, amid a shout of satisfaction from the crowd. After prostrating themselves before Tippoo, they took up their ground facing each other. Each man had on his right hand 4 steel claws fixed to the knuckles. Approaching each other cautiously, they threw with their left hands the garlands of flowers they wore round their necks into the faces of their opponents, trying to take advantage of the moment to strike a blow or to obtain a grip. Each blow laid open the flesh as by a tiger's claws. The great object was to gain a grip, no matter where, which would completely disable the opponent and render him incapable of defending himself. When this was done, the combat between that pair came to an end. After the Ghetties, as these men were named, had retired, a buffalo was matched against a tiger. The tiger was adverse to the contest, but upon some firecrackers being thrown close behind him, he sprang at the buffalo, who had been watching the tiger warily. As the tiger launched itself into the air, the buffalo lowered its head, received the tiger on its sharp horns, and threw it a distance of 10 yards away. No efforts could goad the wounded tiger to continue the fray, so it and the buffalo were taken out, and 2 others brought in. The second tiger was a much more powerful beast than its predecessor, and was indeed larger than any of those in the cages of the palace. It had been captured 4 days before, and was full of fight. It walked round the buffalo 3 or 4 times, and then, with the speed of lightning, sprang upon it, breaking its neck with a single blow from its powerful forepaw. 6 buffaloes in succession were brought in, and were killed, one after the other, by the tiger. Satisfied with what it had done, the tiger paid no attention to the 7th animal, but walked round and round the arena, looking for a means to escape. Then, drawing back, it made a short rush, and sprang at the net, which was 14 feet high. Strong as were the poles that supported the net, it nearly gave way under the impact. The tiger hung 10 feet above the ground, until some of the guards outside ran up, discharging their muskets into the air, when the tiger recommenced its promenade around the foot of the net, roaring and snarling with anger. As it neared the palace, it stopped, and uttered a roar of defiance at those at the windows. Then, apparently, something moving behind the lattice work caught its eye. It moved toward that, crouching, and then, with a tremendous spring, launched itself against the lattice work. The balcony was 10 feet from the ground, but the tiger's spring took it clear of this. The woodwork gave way like paper, and the tiger burst through. A shout of dismay arose from the multitude, but high above this sounded the screams of the women. "Quick, Surajah!" Dick cried, and drawing his keen dagger, he cut through the network and dashed through, followed by his companion. "Stand here!" he cried as they arrived below the balcony. "Steady! Put your hands against the wall." Then he sprang onto Surajah's back, and thence to his shoulder. Drawing his pistols, he put one between his teeth, grasping the other in his right hand. "Steady, Surajah! I am going to stand on your head." He stepped onto his companion's turban, put his left arm on the balcony, and raised himself by it until his arms were above its level. The tiger was standing with its paw upon a prostrate figure, growling savagely, but evidently confused and somewhat dismayed at the piercing screams from the women, most of whom had thrown themselves down on the cushions of the divan. Dick stretched his right hand forward, took a steady aim, and fired. A sharp snarl showed that the shot had taken effect. He dropped the pistol, snatched the other from his mouth, waited for a moment until he could make out the tiger, fired again, and at once dropped to the ground, just as a great body flashed from the window above him. He and Surajah had both had their matchlocks slung over their shoulders, and before the tiger could recover from its spring, they levelled and fired. The tiger rolled over, but regained its feet and made toward them. One of the bullets had, however, struck it in the shoulder and disabled the leg. Its movements were therefore comparatively slow, and they had time to leap aside. Surajah discharged his pistol into the tiger's ear, while Dick brought down his keen sword with all his strength upon its neck, and the tiger rolled over dead. A mighty shout rose from the crowd. "We'd better be off," Dick said, "or we shall have all sorts of questions to answer." They slipped through the hole in the net again, but were so surrounded by people cheering and applauding them that they could not extricate themselves, and a minute later some soldiers ran up, pushed through the crowd to them, and surrounded them. "The Sultan requires your presence," they said, and as resistance was out of the question, Dick and Surajah at once accompanied them to the entrance of the palace. They were led through several large halls until they entered the room where Tippoo was standing. He had just left the women's apartment, where he had hurried to ascertain what damage had been done by the tiger. Dick and his companions salaamed to the ground, in accordance with the custom of the country. "You are brave fellows," the Sultan said graciously, "and all the braver that you risked death not only from the tiger, but for daring to look upon my women unveiled." "I saw nothing, your Highness," Dick said humbly, "save the tiger. That he was standing over a fallen figure I noticed. As soon as my eye fell on him I fired at once, and the second time as soon as the smoke cleared, so that I could catch a glimpse of him." "I pardon you that," Tippoo said, "and in faith you have rendered me a good service, for had it not been for your interference he might have worked havoc in my harem, and that before a single one of my officers or men had recovered his senses." And he looked angrily round at the officers standing near him. "How comes it that you are so quick in thought and execution?" he asked Surajah, as the elder of the two. "My brother and myself have done much hunting among the hills, your Highness, and have learned that, in fighting a tiger, one needs to be quick as well as fearless." "Whence come you?" Tippoo asked. "By your tongue you are strangers." Surajah gave the account that they had agreed upon, as to their birthplace, but he was quick-witted enough to see that it would not be safe to say they were in the service of the Rajah of Bor, as inquiries might be made, and he therefore said, "We came hither to take service either with your Royal Highness or with one of your rajahs, but have as yet found no opportunity of doing so." "It is well," Tippoo said. "Henceforth you are officers in my service. Apartments shall be assigned to you in the Palace. Here is the first token of my satisfaction," and he took out a heavy purse from his girdle and handed it to Surajah. "You are free to go now. I will later on consider what duties shall be assigned to you. When you return, report yourselves to Fazli Ali, my chamberlain," and he indicated a white bearded official among the group standing beside him. Salaaming deeply again, they left the apartments. Not a word was spoken until they were outside the precincts of the Palace. "This makes a sudden change in our plans," Dick said. "Whether for better or worse, I cannot say yet." "I was right in not saying we were in the service of the Rajah of Bor, was I not? I thought that Tippoo might offer to take us into his service, and he might have caused a letter to be sent to the Rajah, saying that he had done so." "Yes, you were quite right, Surajah. I had thought of that myself, and was on thorns when you were telling your story, and felt not a little relieved when you changed the tale. I think that it has turned out for the best. As officers of the Palace, we may be able to obtain some information as to what Christian captives there are, and the prisons where they are confined." "Still more," Surajah said. "When we get to be known as being his officers, we might present ourselves boldly at any of the hill fortresses, as sent there with some orders." "You are right," Dick said. "I had not thought of that. Indeed, we might even produce orders to inspect the prisoners, in order to render an account to Tippoo of their state and fitness for service, and might even show an order for my father to be handed over to us, if we should find him. This is splendid, and I am sure I cannot be too grateful to that tiger for popping into the harem. He has done more for us in a few minutes than we could have achieved in a year. Well, Surajah, if my father is alive, I think now that we have every chance of rescuing him." As they walked through the streets, many of those who had been present at the sports recognized them as the heroes in the stirring episode there, and, judging they would gain a high place in Tippoo's favour, since they were still alive, came up to them and congratulated them on their bravery, and made offers of service. They replied civilly to all who accosted them, but were glad when they turned off to the quiet quarter where Pertaub lived. The Hindoo was surprised indeed when they told him what had happened, and that they were already officers in the Palace, and might consider themselves as standing high in Tippoo's favour. "It is wonderful," he said, when they brought their story to a conclusion. "Surely Providence must have favoured your pious object. Such good fortune would never have occurred to you, had it not been that it was destined you should find your father still alive. But if good fortune befalls you, it is because you deserve it. That you should face a great tiger without hesitation, and slay him, shows how firm your courage is, and the quickness was still more to be admired. No doubt there are many others there who, to gain the favour of the Sultan, would have risked their lives, but you alone of them were quick enough to carry it out." "We were nearest to the spot, Pertaub. Had we been among the crowd farther back, we could have done nothing." "Let us praise where it is due," Surajah said. "I had nothing to do with the affair. I saw the tiger bound through the window, and heard screams, and stood frozen with horror. I did not even see my lord cut through the net. I knew nothing until he seized me by the arm and pulled me after him, and it was not until he sprang upon my back and then upon my shoulders that I knew what he was going to do. I simply aided in dispatching the tiger when he sprang wounded down into the courtyard." "And yet you are a hunter and a soldier," Pertaub said. "This is how it is that the English have become lords of so wide a territory. They are quick. While we hesitate and spend great time in making up our minds to do anything, they decide and act in a moment. They are always ready, we are always slow. They see the point where a blow has to be struck, they make straight to it, and they strike. The English Sahib is very young, and yet to him comes in a moment what is the best thing to be done. He does not stop to think of the danger. While all others stand in consternation, he acts, and slays the tiger before one of them has so much as moved from his place. But indeed, as you say, Tippoo himself told you, your danger was not only from the tiger. The tyrant must indeed have been alarmed for the safety of his harem, when he forgave you what, in the eyes of a Mohammedan, is the greatest offence you can commit. This will, of course, change all of your plans. For the present, at any rate. It may be that, later on, we shall still find occasion for our disguises, as possibly we may fall into disfavour. and have to assume them to make our escape. We may, as Tippoo's officers, manage to obtain entrance into one or two of the hill fortresses, but unless absolutely sent by him, that is the utmost we could hope for, were we missing, messengers would be sent all over the country to order our arrest, and in that case we should have to take to some disguise. The first thing now is to procure our dresses. How much is there in that purse, Surajah? It seems pretty heavy." Surajah poured the gold out on the table. "There are 50 tumauns. That will be more than enough to clothe you handsomely," the Hindoo said. "Much more than enough, I should think, Pertaub. Tippoo likes those round him to be well dressed. It's not only a proof of his generosity, but likes to make a brave show on great occasions, and nothing pleases him more than to be told that neither the Nizam nor any other Indian prince can surpass him in the magnificence of his court. Therefore, the better dressed you are, the more he will be satisfied, for it will seem to him that you appreciate the honour of being officers of the Palace, and that you have laid out his present to the best advantage, and have not a mind to hoard any of it. I will take the matter in hand for you. You will need 2 suits each, one for court ceremonies, and the other for ordinary wear in the Palace." "I shall be very much obliged to you, Pertaub, for indeed I have no idea what ought to be got. Had we better present ourselves at the Palace this evening or tomorrow morning?" "This evening, certainly. Did he take it into his head to inquire whether you were in the Palace, and found that you were not, it might alter his humour towards you altogether. He is changeable in his moods. The favourite of one day may be in disgrace and ordered to execution the next. You will soon feel that it is as if you were in a real tiger's den, and that the animal may at any moment spring upon you. Take with you the clothes you now wear, and those in which you came, so that at any moment, if you see a storm gathering, you can slip on a disguise and leave the Palace unobserved. In that case, hasten here, and you can then dress yourselves as merchants. The worst of it is, Pertaub, that our faces will soon become known to so many in the Palace that they will be recognized, whatever our dress." "A little paint and some false hair, and a somewhat darker stain to your skin, would alter you so that those who know you best would pass you without suspicion. I trust that no such misfortune will befall, but I will keep everything in readiness to effect a transformation, should it be required. Now I will go out at once to get the clothes." In 2 hours he returned, followed by a boy carrying the goods he had purchased, and in a few minutes Dick and his companion were arrayed in court dresses. The turbans were pure white, and the tunic was of dark, rich stuff, thickly woven with gold thread. A short cloak, or mantle, secured at the neck by a gold chain, 3 or 4 inches in length, hung from the back, but could, if necessary, be drawn round the shoulders. A baldric, embroidered with gold, crossed the chest, and from this hung a sword with an ivory handle. The waist sash was of blue and gold in Dick's case, purple and gold in that of Surajah. Silver-mounted pistols and daggers were stuck into the sashes. The dresses were precisely alike, except that they were different in colour. The trousers were white. Surajah was greatly delighted with his dress. Dick laughed. "Of course it comes naturally to you," he said, "but I feel as if I were dressed up for a masquerade." The other suits were similar in style, but the tunics were of richly figured damask instead of cloth of gold. Half an hour later they started for the Palace, a coolie carrying a box containing their second suits, and the simple dresses they had worn on their arrival. Dick could not help smiling at the manner in which the people in the streets obsequiously made way for them. "I shall be very glad," he said, as they traversed the space that divided the town from the fort, "when we have got over the next day or two, and have settled down a bit. It all seems so uncertain, and I have not the most remote idea of what our duties are likely to be. Hitherto we have always had some definite plan of action, and had only ourselves to depend upon. Now everything seems doubtful and uncertain. However, I suppose we shall soon settle down, and we have the satisfaction of knowing that if things do not turn out well, we can go off to our good friend Pertaub, and get out of the place altogether." On arriving at the Palace, they inquired for the chamberlain. "He is expecting you, my lord," one of the attendants said, coming forward. "I will lead you first to the room that is prepared for you, and then take you to Fazli Ali." The room was a commodious one, and the richness of the covering of the divan, and the handsome rugs spread on the floor, were satisfactory signs that the chamberlain considered them prime favourites of the sultan. Having seen the box placed in a corner, and paid the coolie, they followed the attendant along some spacious corridors and passages, until they entered a room where Fazli Ali was seated on a divan. The attendant let the curtains that covered the door drop behind them as they entered. They salaamed to the chamberlain, who looked at them approvingly, and motioned them to take their seats on the divan beside him. "I see," he said kindly, "that you possess good judgment, as well as courage and quickness. The former qualities have won you a place here, but judgment will be needed to keep it. You have laid out your money well, as the sultan loves to see all in the palace well attired, and quiet also, and discreet in behaviour." "Can you give us an idea what our duties will be?" Surajah asked, as Dick had requested him always to be the spokesman, if possible. The chamberlain shook his head. "That will be for the sultan himself to decide. For a time, probably, you will have little to do but to attend at the hours when he gives public audiences. You will, doubtless, occasionally carry his orders to officers in command of troops, at distant places, and will form part of his retinue when he goes beyond the palace. When he sees that you are worthy of his favour, prompt in carrying out his orders, and in all respects trustworthy, he will in time assign special duties to you, but this will depend upon yourselves. As one who admires the courage and promptness that you showed today, and who wishes you well, I would warn you that it is best, when the sultan has had matters to trouble him, and may blame somewhat unjustly, not to seek to excuse yourselves. It is bad to thwart him when he is roused. You can rely upon me to stand your friend, and, when the storm has blown over, to represent the matter to him in a favourable light. The sultan desires to be just, and in his calm moments assuredly is so, but when there is a cloud before his eyes, there is no saying upon whom his displeasure may fall. At present, however, there is little chance of your falling into disgrace, for he is greatly impressed with the service you have rendered him, and especially by the promptness with which you carried it out. After you had gone, he spoke very strongly about it, and said that he would he were possessed of 100 officers capable of such a deed. He would in that case have little fear of any of the foes of his kingdom. It is fortunate that you came here this afternoon. It is well nigh certain that he will ask for you presently, and though he could hardly blame you had you required until tomorrow to complete your preparations, your promptitude will gratify him, and he will, I am sure, be still more pleased at seeing that you have well so laid out his gift. He gave you no orders on the subject, and had you appeared in the dresses you wore this morning, he would doubtless have instructed me to provide you with more suitable attire. The fact that you have so laid out the money will show that you have an understanding of the honour of being appointed to the palace, and a proper sense of fitness. The sultan himself dresses plainly, and, save for a priceless gem in his turban, and another in his sword hilt, there is nothing in his attire to lead a stranger to guess at his rank. But while he does this himself, he expects that all others in the palace should do justice to his generosity. And now you had best return to your room, and remain there until sent for. If he does not think of it himself, I shall, if opportunity occurs, inform him that you have already arrived." They had some difficulty in finding their way back to their room, and had indeed to ask directions of attendants they met before they discovered it. A native was squatting at the door. He rose and salaamed deeply as they came up. "Your slave is appointed to be your attendant, my lords," he said. "Your servant's name is Ibrahim." "Good," Surajah said as he passed him and entered the room. "Now, Ibrahim, tell us about the ways of the palace, for of these we are altogether ignorant. In the first place, about food. Do we provide ourselves, or how is it?" "All in the palace are fed from the sultan's kitchen. At each meal every officer has so many dishes according to his rank. These vary from 3 to 12. In the early morning I shall bring you bread and fruit and sherbet. At 10 o'clock is the first meal, and at 7 there is supper. At 1 o'clock the kitchens are open, and I can fetch you a dish of pilau, kebabs, a chicken, or any other refreshment that you may desire. At present I have no orders as to how many dishes your Excellencies will receive at the 2 meals." "We shall not be particular about that," Surajah said. "It is evident that we shall fare well, at any rate." "I am told to inform you, my lords, that the sultan has ordered 2 horses to be placed at your service. A Gorawalla has been appointed to take charge of them. His name is Surfojee. If you ask for him at the stable, you will be directed to him, and he will show you the horses. In an hour supper will be served, but this evening I shall only be able to bring you 3 dishes each, Such is always the rule until the Sultan's pleasure has been declared." Ibrahim then proceeded to light 2 lamps hanging from the ceiling, for it was now getting dusk, and then, finding that his masters had no further need of his services, he retired. "So far so good, Surajah. We are certainly in clover as far as comfort is concerned, and the only drawback to the situation is Tippoo's uncertain temper. However, we must try our best to satisfy him. We have every reason to stand well with him, and if he sees that we are really anxious to please him, we ought to be able to avoid falling into disgrace, even when he is in one of his worst moods." Their attendant presently brought up the 6 portions of food, and they enjoyed their meal heartily. Each had an ample portion of pillau of rice and chicken, a plate of stew, which Dick thought was composed of game of some kind, and a confection in which honey was the predominating flavour. With this they drank water, deliciously cooled by being hung up in porous jars. Surajah ate his food with the dexterity of long habit, but Dick had not yet learned to make his bread fulfil the functions of spoon and fork, for at his uncle's table European methods of eating were adopted. Half an hour after they had finished, an officer presented himself at the door, and said that he was ordered to conduct them to the Sultan. Tippoo had supped in the harem, and was now seated on a divan in a room of no great size, but richly hung with heavy silken curtains, and carpeted with the richest rugs. 2 or 3 of his chief officers were seated beside him. 7 or 8 others were standing on either side of the room. A heavy glass chandelier of European manufacture hung from the richly carved ceiling, and the 50 candles in it lighted up the room. The chamberlain met them at the door, and advanced with them towards Tippoo. "Great Sultan," he said, "these are the young men whom it has pleased your Highness to appoint officers in the Palace." The 2 lads salaamed until their turbans touched the ground. "Truly they are comely youths," Tippoo said, "and one would scarcely deem them capable of performing such a feat as that they have accomplished this morning. Well, my slayers of tigers, you have found everything fitly provided?" "Far more so than our deeds merit, your Highness," Surajah replied. "We have found everything that heart could desire, and only hope for an opportunity to show ourselves worthy of your favours." "Oh, you have done that beforehand," Tippoo said graciously, "and I am glad to see by your attire that you are conscious that, as my officers, it is fitting that you should make a worthy appearance. It shows that you have been well brought up, and are not ignorant of what is right and proper. At present you will receive orders from Fazli Ali, and will act as assistant chamberlains until I decide in what way your services can be made most useful. Now follow me, there are others who wish to see you." Rising, Tippoo led the way through a door with double hangings into a room considerably larger than that which they had just left. The chandeliers at the end of the room where they stood were all lighted, while the other end was in comparative darkness. Leaving them standing alone, Tippoo walked toward the other end, and clapped his hands. Immediately a number of closely veiled figures entered, completely filling the end of the room. "These are the young men," Tippoo said to them. "It is the one on the right to whom it is chiefly due that the tiger did not commit havoc among you. It was he who climbed up the balcony and fired twice at the beast. You owe your lives to him and his companion, for among all my officers and guards there was not one who was quick-witted enough to move as much as a finger." There was a faint murmur of surprise among the veiled figures at the youth of their preserver. "Hold your heads fully up," Tippoo went on, for Dick and his companion, after making a deep salaam, had stood with bent heads and with eyes fixed upon the ground. Then 2 of the attendants, girls of 13 or 14 years old, came forward from behind the others, each bearing a casket. "These are presented to you, with my permission, by the ladies whose lives you have saved," Tippoo said, "and should you at any time have a favour to ask, or even should you fall under my displeasure, you can rely upon their good offices in your behalf." There was another low murmur from the other end of the hall. Then Tippoo clapped his hands, and the women moved out as noiselessly as they had entered. "You can retire now," Tippoo said as he moved toward the door into the other room. "Be faithful, be discreet, and your fortune is secured." He pointed to another door, and then rejoined his councillors. Dick and his companion stood in an attitude of deep respect until the hanging had fallen behind the Sultan, then went out by the door he had pointed to, and made their way back to their own room. "Truly, Surajah, fortune is favouring us mightily. This morning we walked the streets in fear of being questioned and arrested. This evening we are officers of the palace, favoured by Tippoo and under the protection of the harem. I wondered what the ladies have given us." They opened the caskets, which were of considerable size. As they examined the contents, exclamations of surprise broke from them. Each contained some 30 or 40 little parcels done up in paper, and on these being opened they were found to contain trinkets and jewels of all kinds. Some were very costly and valuable. All were handsome. It was evident that every one of the ladies who had been in the room when the tiger burst in had contributed a token of her gratitude. Many of the more valuable gems had been evidently taken from their settings, as if the donors did not care that jewels they had worn should be exposed to view. One parcel contained 20 superb pearls, another a magnificent diamond, and 10 rubies, and so on, down to the more humble gifts, although these were valuable, of those of lower rank. Dick's presents were much more costly than those of his companion, and as soon as this was seen to be the case, Dick proposed that they should put them all together and divide equally. This, however, Surajah would not hear of. "The whole thing is due to you," Surajah said. "It would never have occurred to me to interfere at all. I had no part in the matter at all, beyond aiding to kill a wounded tiger, and it was no more than I have done many times among our hills, and though thought nothing of. These jewels are vastly more than I deserve for my share in the affair. I do not know much about the value of gems, but they must be worth a large sum, and nothing will induce me to take any of those that you have so well earned." "I wonder whether Tippoo knows what they have given us," Dick said, after in vain trying to alter his companion's decision. "Oh, I don't suppose he troubles himself about it. No doubt he was asked permission for each to make a present to us. The jewels in the harem must be of enormous value, as for the last 15 years Tippoo has been gathering spoil from all southern India, having swept the land right up to the gates of Madras. They say that his treasures are fabulous, and no doubt the ladies of his harem have shared largely in the spoils. The question is, what had we best do with these caskets? We know that, in the course of our adventures, it may very well happen that we shall be closely searched, and it would never do to risk having such valuables found upon us." "No, I should say that we had best bury them somewhere. Some of these merchants here may be honest enough for us to leave the jewels in their care, without anxiety, but as they themselves may at any moment be seized and compelled to give up their last penny, these things would be no safer with them than with us. As to Pertaub, I have absolute faith in him, but he himself is liable to be seized at any moment. However, I should say that we had better consult him. If we were to bury them, say under the floor of his house, we might leave them there for a time. If we saw any chance of this place being, some day, captured by our people, we could wait till then for their recovery. But the war may not be renewed for years. Possibly Pertaub may be able to arrange to send them down, only entrusting a portion at a time to a messenger, so that, if he got into trouble, we should only lose what he had upon him. We'll put the caskets into our box, and lock it up for the present, and take them down to Pertaub tomorrow evening after it gets dark. It will be as well to get them off our minds as soon as possible, for although just at present we are in high favour, there is no saying how long that may last, or when it may be necessary for us to move." Chapter 13. Officers of the Palace. The next morning, just as they had finished their early breakfast, they were sent for by Fazli Ali. "You had better accompany me on my rounds," he said. "I shall not commit any special duties to you until I see whether the Sultan intends that you shall remain with me, or whether, as is far more likely, he assigns other work to you. Were you placed in separate charges in the Palace, I should have to fill your places if you left. Therefore, I propose that, at present, you shall assist me in general supervision. We will first go to the kitchens. These give me more trouble than any other part of my duties. In the first place, one has to see that the contractors do their work properly, that the number of carcasses sent in is correct, the flesh of good quality, and that the list of game is correct. Then one has to check the amount of rice and other grains sent in from the storehouses, the issue of spices, and other articles of that kind. These matters do not require doing every day. The kitchen officers are responsible for them, but once or twice a week I take care to be present, to see that all is right. Then I ascertain that everything is in good and proper order in the kitchen, listen to complaints, and, of course, decide disputes. When we have done there, we will see that the requisitions for the harem are properly complied with, and that the sweetmeats, perfumes, silks, muslins, as required, are furnished. The payment of salaries does not come into my department. That is one of the functions of the treasurer of the palace, who also discharges all accounts upon my signature that they are correct. Then I take a general tour of the palace to see that the attendants have done their duties, and that everything is clean and in order. As a rule, I have finished everything before the morning meal is served. The details of making up the accounts are, of course, done by clerks. After that, my duties depend entirely upon the Sultan. If there is any state ceremonial in the palace, I summon those whose duty it is to attend, and see that everything is properly arranged and in order. If not, I am generally at His Highness's disposal. Unless you receive any instructions from me, you will be free to occupy yourselves as you like. You will, of course, take part in all public ceremonials. You will be among the officers who accompany the Sultan when he goes out, and will be liable to be summoned to attend him at all times. Therefore, although free to go into town or ride beyond the island, it is well that you should never be long absent, and that, if you wish to be away for more than 2 hours at a time, you should first let me know, as I may be able to tell you if the Sultan is likely to require you. He has fixed your pay at 400 rupees a month." Dick, as he accompanied the chamberlain on his tour through the palace, was struck with the order and method that prevailed in every department, and the chamberlain told him that Tippoo himself inquired closely into details, and that, large as was the daily expenditure, no waste of any kind was allowed. The splendour of some of the apartments was surprising, especially the throne room. The throne itself was of extraordinary magnificence. It was of gold, thickly inlaid with gems. On the apex stood a jewelled peacock, covered entirely with diamonds, emeralds, and rubies, with pendants of pearls. In front of it stood a golden tiger's head, which served as a footstool. On either side were standards of purple silk, having a sun with golden rays in the centre. The spearheads were of gold, set with jewels. When the work of inspection was finished, they went back to their room, where their attendant soon afterwards, with an air of great exultation, brought their meal, which consisted of 9 dishes each, a proof of the high favour with which Tippoo regarded them. After this meal was eaten, they went down to the stables, and were pleased indeed with the mounts provided for them. They were fine animals, with handsome saddles and trappings, and Dick and Surajah at once mounted and rode through the town to the other extremity of the island. As they wore scarves that had been furnished them by Fazli Ali, showing that they were officers of the palace, they were everywhere greeted with deep salaams. "I hope," Dick said, as they returned from their ride, "that Tippoo will not be long before he finds us some other duties. There is certainly nothing very interesting in counting carcasses or seeing rice measured." "That is true enough," Surajah agreed, "but we must not be impatient. Fortune has befriended us marvellously, and I have great faith that it will continue to do so. We must be content to wait." "Yes, I know that, Surajah, but I think it is all the more difficult to do so, because we have done so much in a short time. It seems as if one ought to go on at the same rate." That evening they went down, as they had arranged, with ordinary wraps round their gay attire, to Pertaub's, taking with them the caskets of gems. The Hindoo received them warmly. "I saw you ride through the streets this morning, although you did not notice me. Truly, you made a good appearance, and were well mounted. I have heard from one of our people, who is a servant in the palace, that you stand in high favour." "We have brought you down these 2 caskets of gems," Dick said. "They were given us by the ladies of the harem, and many of the stones, Surajah thinks, are very valuable. We don't know what to do with them, and wanted to know whether you could arrange to send them down to Tripataly for us." "Oh, I would not undertake to do so, if they are valuable," Pertaub said. "The prospects of fresh troubles are stronger every day, and the roads are so closely watched, especially those through the passes, that it would be running a terrible risk to trust valuables to anyone." "In that case, Pertaub, we thought you might bury them in the ground under your house. But first, look at some of the stones, and tell us what you think of them." The Hindoo opened Surajah's casket, and undid many of the little parcels. "Assuredly they are valuable," he said. "Some of them much more so than others, but if all are like these that I have opened, they must be worth at least 50,000 rupees." "Now look at this casket, Pertaub." The Hindoo uttered an exclamation of surprise as he opened some of the packets, and taking out some of the larger gems, he examined them by the light of his lamp. "I could not place a value on these," he said at last. "The ladies must indeed have felt that they owed their lives to you. The gems are a fortune. Doubtless they are the spoils of a score of districts, and Tippoo must have distributed them lavishly among his wives, or they could never have made such rich presents. I would bury them, Sahib, for surely they could not be entrusted even to the most faithful messengers in times like these. But though, if you like, I will hide them here, I think it would be far safer for you to take them across the river, and bury them in a wood, marking well the trees, that you may know the place again. For although methinks Tippoo's agents believe that they have squeezed the last rupee from me, one can never tell. I might again be tortured, and none can say that they are brave enough to bear the agonies that Tippoo's executioners inflict. I will bury them for tonight, but I pray you give me notice the first time you cross the river. I will be at the other side of the ford, with the jewels hidden in a sack on an ass. This I will drive forward, when I see you crossing the ford. You will follow me till I enter a wood. I will have the tools, and when you join me, you can go on a short distance and bury them. I do not wish to see where you hide them, but will move about, to make sure that none come near you when so engaged. You had best take out a few small stones, which you will find as good as money, and much more easily concealed, for in every town or large village you will find a jeweller, who will give you silver for them." "I think that will be a very good plan, Pertaub, and I will certainly carry it out." A month passed without any change in their work. They rode, with other officers, behind Tippoo's palanquin when he went out, which he did almost every day, to inspect the progress of the fortifications, and were among the brilliant circle behind his throne when he gave orders. By this time they had come to know most of the other court officials, and were able to inquire cautiously about the prisons. They could learn nothing, however, of any English prisoners in Seringapatam, save those they had seen in the hut in the fort. 6 weeks after their appointment as palace officers, Dick and Surajah were sent for by Tippoo. "I am about to employ you," the sultan said, when they appeared before him, "on a mission. You are strangers here, and are unconnected with any of my officers, and I can, therefore, place greater reliance on your reports than upon those of men who have other interests than my own to serve. I desire you to go and inspect the hill forts, to see how the repairs of the fortifications injured by the English are progressing, and to make sure that the cannon are in good order, and the supply of ammunition plentiful. You have shown that you are quick sighted and sharp. Look round the defences, and if you see aught that can be done to strengthen them, confer with the governors, learn their opinions on the subject, and if they agree with you, they will be authorized to take men from the country round to strengthen the fortifications, and I will forward at once such guns and stores as may be required. After the inspection of each fort, you will dispatch a mounted messenger to me with your report, and you will state which fort you will next visit, in order that I may dispatch there any order that I may have to give you. Do your duty well, and I shall know how to reward you. In order that your authority may be increased, you are both named colonels in the army. Fazli will furnish you with a written copy of the orders I have given you, and with authority, under my seal, to enter and inspect all fortresses, and to consult with the governors as to everything considered by them as necessary for their better defence. The last time the English came, they captured Nundidroog and other hill fortresses that we had regarded as impregnable, simply because the governors were overconfident and the defences had been neglected. This must not occur again, and if there is failure in the defences, I shall hold you responsible. Therefore, take care that you do not neglect, not only to see that the repairs are being well carried out, but to recommend additions to the fortifications, wherever it seems to you that there is even a possibility of an enemy making his way up. You will take with you 20 troopers as an escort, but these are not to enter any of the fortresses with you, for treachery is always possible, and no one, save the garrisons, must be acquainted with the defences of the hill forts." Surajah expressed his thanks to the sultan for entrusting them with the mission, and assured him that their inspection of the forts should be careful and complete, and that they would start in an hour's time. When they reached their own room, Dick threw up his turban in delight. "Was there ever such a stroke of good fortune?" he exclaimed. "The Tiger business was as nothing to this. Tippoo has given us the mission of all others that will enable us to carry out our search. Our work is as good as done. That is to say," he added more gravely, We are at least pretty sure to find my father out, if he is alive. Besides, we may get information that will be of great use if the war is renewed. Now, we had better, in the first place, go and see Fazli and get our instructions. We'll order our horses to be in readiness to start as soon as we have had our meal. We may not get another chance of eating today. I should like to take Ibrahim with us. He is a capital servant, and a strong, active fellow. I believe he is fond of us, and we shall want someone who can cook for us, and buy things, and so on. I'll speak to Fazli about it." The chamberlain looked up as they entered the room where he was engaged in dictating to a clerk. "I congratulate you on your mission," he said. "It will involve a great deal of hard work, but as you have told me how you longed for some duty outside the Palace, you will not mind that. Tippoo consulted me before sending for you. I told him you were diligent in the service, and I felt sure you would do your best in the present matter, and that, as you were accustomed in the pursuit of game to ascend mountains and scale precipices, you were far more likely to find the weak spots in the forts than an old officer, who would be likely to take everything for granted. There is no doubt that many of the garrisons are very far from being efficient. They have been stationed in the forts for many years. Discipline, both among officers and men, is sure to have become lax, and there will be much that young men, going freshly into the matter, will see needs amendment. That the walls are often weak, and the cannon so old as to be almost useless, I am well aware. For sometimes newly appointed governors have sent in strong protests and urgent requests that they might be furnished with new cannon, and that walls and defences might be renewed. But what with the wars, the removal of the capital, and the building and fortification of this place, these matters have been neglected, and it is only now that the Sultan sees the necessity of putting the fortifications of all these places in good repair. I have had the papers prepared and signed. Your escort has been ordered. Is there anything else you can think of?" "We should like to take our Palace attendant with us," Surajah said. "He is a good man, and, starting so suddenly, we should have difficulty in hiring servants we could rely on." "I have thought of that," the chamberlain replied, "and have ordered a horse to be got in readiness for him, together with a spare animal to carry food and necessaries for your journey. You will need them on your marches, and may even be glad of them in some of the smaller forts, where the fare will be very rough." When they returned to their room, they found Ibrahim awaiting them. He was evidently delighted at the prospect of accompanying them. "My lords," he said, "I have the pack horse saddled in the stable, with 2 great sacks and ropes. Is it your pleasure that I should go down at once to the market, and buy flour and rice, spices, and other things necessary?" "Certainly, Ibrahim, but it will not be necessary to buy much meat. It will not keep, and we ought always to be able to buy a sheep or a fowl from villagers. Get some thick wadded sleeping rugs, some cooking pots, and whatever you think is necessary. Do not waste any time, for we will start immediately after our meal." As soon as Ibrahim had left, Dick said to Surajah, "I will hurry down to the town and see Pertaub. You had best remain here, in case Tippoo should send for us to give us final instructions. You can say, should he ask, that I have gone down to the town to get a supply of powder and balls for our pistols, writing materials, and other things that we may require," which will be true enough. It's most lucky that we buried our jewels in the forest 10 days ago, for we should not have had time to do it now. Dick returned in time for the meal, which was brought up by another servant. "Pertaub was delighted to hear of our good fortune," Dick said, on his return. "He will keep our disguises by him, and if we have occasion for them, will either bring them himself with the merchandise, or will send them by a trusty messenger, to any place we may mention, directly he hears from us. I do not think there is any chance of our wanting them, but it is as well to be prepared for any contingency that may occur." Half an hour later, they started at the head of an escort of 20 troopers, Ibrahim riding in the rear, leading the pack horse, which carried a change of clothes and thick cloths to keep out the night dews, as well as the stock of provisions. Ibrahim had also purchased 2 very large dark blankets, that could be used for a temporary shelter. Surajah now felt quite at home, for he was engaged in the same sort of duty he performed at Tripataly, and more than one pair of dark eyes glanced admiringly at the 2 young officers as they rode down to the ford. They had been furnished by Fazli with a list of the forts they were to visit, and the order in which they were to take them. The first on the list being Savandroog, 50 miles northeast of the city. After a ride of 20 miles, they halted at a village. To the surprise of the troopers, Surajah gave orders that nothing was to be taken by force. as he was prepared to pay for all provisions required. As soon as the villagers understood this, ample supplies were brought in. Rice, grain, and fowls were purchased for the soldiers, and forage for the horses, and after seeing that all were well prepared for, the two officers went to a room that had been placed at their service in the principal house in the village. Ibrahim justified his assertion that he was a good cook by turning out an excellent curry. By the time they had finished this it was getting dark, and after again visiting the troopers and seeing that their own horses were fed and well groomed, they retired to bed. An early start was made the next morning, and at 10 o'clock they approached Savandroog. It was one of the most formidable of the hill forts of Mysore, and stood upon the summit of an enormous mass of granite, covering a base of 8 miles in circuit, and rising in ragged precipices to the height of 2,500 feet. The summit of the rock was divided by a deep chasm into 2 peaks, each of which was crowned with strong works and capable of separate defence. The lower part of the hill was, wherever ascent seemed possible, protected by walls, one behind the other. The natives had regarded the fort as absolutely impregnable, until it was stormed and taken by the troops under Lord Cornwallis. Dick looked with intense interest at the great rock, with its numerous fortifications. The damages committed by the British guns could not be seen at this distance, and it seemed to him well nigh impossible that the place could have been captured. They rode on until they neared the entrance in the wall that encircled the fort, at the side at which alone access was considered possible. They were challenged as they approached. Ordering the troopers to remain behind, Dick and Surajah rode forward. "We are the bearers," Surajah cried out as they reined in their horses within 20 yards of the gate, "of an order from the Sultan for our admittance, and of a letter to Mirza Muhammad Buxshi, the governor." "I will send up word to him," an officer on the wall replied. "I can admit no one until I have received his orders to do so." "How long will it be before we receive an answer?" "An hour and a half at the earliest. I regret that your Excellencies will be inconvenienced, but my orders are absolute." "I do not blame you," Surajah replied. "It is necessary that you should always be vigilant," and they retired under the shade of a tree, 150 yards from the gate. Ibrahim spread out the rugs, and they proceeded to light the fire and to prepare a pilau of rice and fowl, while Dick and his companion regarded the rock with fixed attention, and conversed together as to the possibility of ascending at any of the points so steep as to be left undefended by walls. They concluded at last that it would be next to impossible to climb the rock anywhere on the side that faced them, save by scaling several walls. They had just finished their luncheon when the gate opened, and an officer and 4 soldiers issued out. They at once rose and went to meet them. "I have the governor's order to admit you, on the production of the Sultan's pass." Surajah produced the document. The officer at once recognized the seal, and carried it to his forehead, salaaming deeply. "Your troopers can enter at the gate, but cannot proceed farther than the second wall." "Can we ride up, or must we walk?" Dick asked. "You can ride," he replied. "The road is steep, but nowhere so steep that horses cannot mount it." After the party had entered the gate, it was at once closed and bolted. The troopers dismounted and were led to a small barrack, while Surajah and Dick, accompanied by the officer and 4 soldiers on foot, rode on. The road was a better one than Dick had expected. It was just wide enough for a cart to proceed up it, and was cut out of the solid rock. It turned and zigzagged continually, and at each angle was a small fort, whose guns swept the approach. They passed under a score of gateways, each defended by guns, and after upwards of an hour's climbing, at a quick pace, they approached one of the forts on its summit. The governor met them at the gate. "You will pardon my not descending to meet you below," the governor said, "but I am not so young as I used to be, and the journey up and down fatigues me much." Dick and Surajah dismounted, and the former presented the 2 documents. The governor, after reading the pass, bowed, and led the way into the interior of the fort, and they were soon seated on a divan in his quarters, when he read the circular letter. "I am glad indeed," he said when he had finished, "that the Sultan is pleased to take into consideration the many demands I have made for cannon and ammunition. A large number of the pieces are past service, and they would be as dangerous to those who fired them as to those at whom they were aimed, while I have scarcely powder enough to furnish 3 rounds for each. As to the defences, I have done my best to strengthen them. Idleness is bad for all men, most of all for soldiers, and I have kept them well employed at repairing the effects of the English fire. Still, there is much to do yet before they are finished, and there are points where fortifications might be added with advantage. These I will gladly point out to you. They have been beyond our means here, for, as you will perceive, it will need blasting in many places to scarp the rock, and to render inaccessible several points at which active men can now climb up. For this work powder is required, and I would submit that, for such hard work, it will be needful to supply extra rations to the troops, for the present scale scarcely suffices to keep the men efficient, especially as most of them have their wives and families dependent on them. I have no doubt that the Sultan will accede to any reasonable requests, your Excellency. He is anxious that the walls of the fort should be placed in the best possible condition for defence. No one doubts that we shall ere long be again at war with England, and although the Sultan relies much upon large reinforcements that have been promised by France, with whom he has entered into an alliance, they have not yet arrived, and he may have to bear the brunt of the attack of the English by himself." "I have heard of this," the governor said, "and regret that we shall again have the Feringhees upon us. As for the Mahrattis or the Nizam, I heed them not. They are dust, whom the Sultan could sweep from his path. But these English are terrible soldiers. I have fought against them under Hyder, and in the last war they again showed their valour. And the strangest thing is that they make the natives under them fight as bravely as they do themselves. As to forts, nothing is safe from them. Were all the troops of the Nizam and the Mahrattis combined to besiege us, I should feel perfectly safe, while were there but 500 Englishmen, I should tremble for the safety of the fortress. You have come up the hill and have seen for yourselves how strong it is, and yet they took the place without the loss of a single man. I was not here, for I was in command of Kisnagherry at the time, and succeeded in holding it against their assaults. When the war was over, and Kisnagherry was ceded to them, I was appointed to this fortress, which seems to me to be even stronger than that was. The commander was a brave man, the garrison was strong, there was no suspicion of treachery, and though at last the troops were seized with panic, as they might well be when they saw that they were unable to arrest the advance of the enemy, the defence up to that time had been stout. The English brought up guns where it was thought no guns could be taken. They knocked the defences to pieces, and after winning their way to the top, in one day captured this fort and that on the hill yonder. It seems miraculous." Coffee was brought in, and pipes, for although Tippoo was violently opposed to smoking, and no one would venture upon the use of tobacco in the palace or fort, old officers like the governor in distant commands did not relinquish tobacco. "It is necessary here," the governor said as he filled his pipe. "The country round is terribly unhealthy, and the air is full of fever. I do not discourage its use among the men, for they would die off like flies did they not smoke to keep out the bad air. The climate is indeed the best protection to the fort, for an army that sat down for any length of time before it would speedily melt away." He opened a box that stood on the divan beside him. "I have copies here," he said, taking some papers out, "of the memorials that I have sent in to the Sultan as to the guns. This is the last. It was sent in 2 months ago. You see, I asked for 49 heavy pieces. Of these, 30 are to replace guns that are honeycombed or split. The other 11 are for new works. I asked for 32 lighter ones or howitzers, and 100 wall guns. Of course, I could do with less, but to place the fort in a perfect state of defence, that is the number that I and my artillery officer think are requisite. Of powder, we have not more than 1.5 tons, and if the siege were to be a long one, we might require 10 times as much. We have not more than 8 rounds of shot for each gun, and we ought to have at least 50 for the heavy pieces, and 20 for those defending the path up the hill." Dick made a note of the figures in a pocketbook he had bought for the purpose. "As for provisions," the governor went on, "we ought to have large stores of rice and grain. The magazines are nearly empty, and as we have 800 men in garrison, and perhaps twice as many women and children, we should require a large store were we blockaded for any time." "Are the troops in good condition?" Surajah asked. The governor shook his head. "Many of them are past the term of service, but until I get reinforcements to supply their places, I shall not venture to discharge them. Many others are wasted by fever, and I must say from insufficient rations. which not only weakens their bodies but lowers their spirits. As long as there was no fear of attack, this mattered little, but if the English are coming again, we shall want well-fed and contented men to oppose them. I see by the stars on your turbans that you are both colonels as well as officers of the palace. You are fortunate in obtaining that rank so young." "It was due to the sultan's favour," Surajah said. "The other day at the sports a tiger burst into the sultan's zenana, and we were lucky enough to kill it. That is, my friend did most of the killing. I only gave the brute the final coup." "Ah, it was you who performed that deed," the governor said warmly. "I heard the news from one of my officers who was on leave and returned yesterday. Truly it was a gallant action, and one quickly done. No wonder that you obtained the sultan's favour, and your rank as colonel. I was a sportsman in my young days, but I think I should have been more frightened at the thought of taking a peep into the sultan's zenana than I should have been of fighting the tiger." "I did not think anything about it," Dick said, "until it was all over. I heard some women scream, and being quite close, went to their assistance, without a thought whether they might be the ladies of the zenana or servants of the palace. But indeed I saw nothing save the tiger, and only vaguely observed that there were women there at all." "It was well that the sultan took the view he did of the matter," the governor said. "I have known men put to death for deeds that were but trifles in comparison to looking into the zenana. Now, Colonel, I will send for my artillery officer and the horses, and we will ride round the fortifications on the brow of the hill, inspect the two forts closely, and will point out to you the spots where it appears to us the defences ought to be strengthened." Chapter 14: A Surprise. Dick was much pleased with the governor. He was evidently an outspoken old soldier, and though rough, his bearded face had an honest and kindly expression. And Dick thought to himself, "If my father fell into his hands, I don't think he would be treated with any unnecessary hardship, though no doubt the sultan's orders would be obeyed." When a soldier came in to say that the horses were at the door, they went out. An officer was standing beside them, and the governor presented him as his chief artillery officer. "You have not brought your horse," he said. "No, your excellency. The distance is not great, and we should need to dismount so many times to get a view from the walls that it would not be worth while to ride." "In that case, we may as well walk also," Dick said. "I would rather do so too," the governor said. "I proposed riding, because I thought you might be tired. As Bakir Miram says, the distance is not great. The walls themselves, with the exception of those of the two forts, are not more than half a mile in extent, for in most places the rocks go sheer down, and their defences are, of course, unnecessary. We will inspect this fort first." They went round the walls, Dick and his companion listening to the suggestions of the two officers. The principal one was that a wall should be raised inside the gate. "The English, last time, got in here by rushing in at the tail of the fugitives from below. They were in before the gates could be closed, and took our men so completely by surprise that they were seized with a panic. Were we to raise a semicircular wall behind the gateway, such a thing could not occur again," the governor said. "Of course, there would be a gate in the inner wall, but not immediately behind the outer gateway, as if so placed it would be destroyed by the cannon shots that battered the outer gate in. I should therefore put it at one end of the inner wall. This gate would be generally open, but in case of a siege I should have it blocked up with stones piled behind it, placing a number of ladders by which men running in could get on to the walls, and however closely they were pursued, could make a stand there until the ladders were pulled up." "That would be an excellent idea," Surajah said gravely, "and I will certainly lay it before the sultan. I suppose you would propose the same for the other fort?" "Just the same." "The only thing that I would observe," Dick said, "is that if an enemy once got a footing on the top there, you could not hope to make a long defence of these forts." "That is so," the governor agreed. "The strength of the defence is not here, but on the upward road, and if the English once gained the top of the forts must fall. But at least it shall not be said, as long as I am governor, that Savandroog fell almost bloodlessly. In these forts we can at least die bravely and sell our lives to the last. It is for that reason I desire that they shall be so defended that they cannot be carried, as they were before, by a sudden rush." The other fort was then visited, and a tour made round the walls. The suggestions offered by the governor and the officers were all noted down and approved. Then they made what was, to Dick, the most important part of the inspection, namely, an examination of the undefended portion of the rock. The result showed him that the builders of the defences had not acted unwisely in trusting solely to nature. At many points the rock fell away in precipices hundreds of feet deep. At other points, although the descent was less steep, it was, as far as he could see from above, altogether unclimbable. But this he thought he would be able to judge better from below. "Do you have sentries around here at night?" he asked the governor. "No, it would not be necessary, even if an enemy were encamped below. If you will ride round the foot of the hill when you leave, you will see for yourself that, save from the side you came up, the place is absolutely inaccessible." The view from the top of the hill was superb. Away to the northeast the governor pointed out the pagodas of Bangalore, 22 miles away. The distance in the clear air seemed comparatively trifling. "Are there many troops here?" Dick asked. "There are about 5 battalions of the regular troops and 3 Chelah battalions. These can hardly be counted as troops. They have never been of the slightest use. In the last war they ran like sheep. It's a fancy of the Sultan's, but indeed he can hardly expect men to fight who have been forced into the ranks and made to accept Mohammedanism against their will. Naturally they regard an invader not as an enemy but as a deliverer. Of course the Sultan's idea was that since the native troops, drilled and led by Englishmen, fought so well, the Chelahs, who were also drilled and led by Englishmen, would do the same. But the Company's troops are willing soldiers, and it is the English leading more than the English drill that makes them fight. If the Chelahs were divided among the hill fortresses, they might do good service, and I could, as far as fighting goes, do with a battalion of them here, for, mixed up with my men, they would have to do their duty. But, of course, they will never be placed in the hill forts, for one would never be safe from treachery. Even if all the lower walls were in the hands of my own men, some of the Chelahs would be sure to manage to desert, and give information as to all the defences." A considerable portion of the upper plateau of the rock was occupied by the huts of the troops, for the forts were much too small to contain them and their families. On their way back they passed through these. Dick looked anxiously about for white faces, but could see none, nor any building that seemed to him likely to be used as a prison. When they returned to the governor's quarters, they found that a room had been placed at their disposal, and they presently sat down to dinner with him. "I suppose you have no English prisoners here?" Dick said carelessly, when the meal was over. The governor paused a moment before he replied. "I don't want any of them here," he said shortly. "Batches are sent up sometimes from Bangalore, but it is only for execution. I am a loyal subject of the Sultan, but I would that this work could be done elsewhere. Almost all the executions take place in the hill forts, in order, I suppose, that they may be done secretly. I obey orders, but I never see them carried out. I never even see the captives. They have done no harm, or at most one of their number has tried to escape, for which they are not to be blamed. I always have them shot, whether that is the mode of execution ordered or not. It's a soldier's death, and the one I should choose myself, and so that they are dead it cannot matter little to the Sultan how they die. If they were all shot as soon as they were taken, I should not think so much of it, but after being held captive for years and compelled to work, it seems to me that their lives should be spared. As far as giving up my own life is concerned, I of course would willingly do it at the orders of the Sultan, but these executions make me ill. I lose my appetite for weeks afterwards. Let us talk of something else." And the governor puffed furiously away at the hookah he had just lighted. Then the conversation turned to the forts again. "No, I do not find the life dull," he said, in answer to a remark of Dick's. "I did so at first, but one soon becomes accustomed to it. I have my wife and 2 daughters, and there are 10 officers, so that I can have company when I choose. All the officers are married, and that gives society. Up here we do not observe strictly the rules of the plains, and although the ladies of course wear veils when they go beyond the house, they put them aside indoors, and the families mix freely with each other, so that we get on very well. You see, there are very few changes ever made, and as many of the ladies are, like my wife, no longer young, we treat them as comrades." In the morning Dick and Surajah mounted their horses, took a hearty farewell of the governor, and rode down to the gate. A soldier had been sent down half an hour before, and they found their escort in readiness to move. They had decided that, before going to the next fort, they would ride round the foot of the hill of Savandroog. This they did, going at a foot pace, and scanning the cliffs and slopes as they passed. Sometimes they reined up their horses and rode a little farther back, so as to have a view to the very summit. When they completed the round, they agreed that there were but 2 spots where it seemed to them that an ascent was barely possible, and they were very doubtful whether the difficulties, when examined more closely, would not prove to be absolutely insurmountable. "This is not a satisfactory outlook," Dick said, "but fortunately there is now no motive for climbing the precipice. Certainly those places would be of no use to a party wanting to make an attack. In the first place, though you and I might get up with soft shoes on, I am sure that English soldiers with muskets and ammunition pouches could never do it, especially at night, and in the daytime even if a body of troops strong enough to be of any use could get up, those who first arrived at the top would be killed before the others could come to their assistance, and a few stones rolled down would sweep all behind them to the bottom. I don't like turning my back on the place," he went on, as they turned their horses' heads to the south, for Savandroog was the farthest north of the forts they were to visit. "It seems to me that, even now, my father may be there." "How can that be, Dick?" Surajah said in surprise. "Nothing could be more straightforward than the governor seemed to be. I thought he was even rash in speaking as frankly as he did to us." "Oh, I think he saw there was no fear of our repeating what he said, Surajah. He is a frank, outspoken old soldier, and has evidently been so disgusted at the treatment of the prisoners that he could not mince his words. And yet, you know, he did not absolutely say he had no prisoners." "No, I noticed that he did not reply directly to your question. On the contrary, he distinctly hesitated before he spoke. Now, why should he have done that? He might just as well have said, 'No, I have no prisoners. They are only sent up here for execution.' That would have been his natural answer. Instead of that, he hesitated, and then began, 'I don't want any of them here. Batches are sent up sometimes from Bangalore.' Now, why did he shirk the question? If it had been any other subject, I might not have noticed that he had not really answered it, but, of course, as it was so important a one, I was listening most anxiously for his reply, and noticed his hesitation at once, and that he gave no direct answer at all. Now, think it over, Surajah. Why should he have hesitated, and why should he have turned the question off without answering it, unless there had been some reason? And if so, what could that reason be?" Surajah had no suggestion to make, and they rode on for some distance in silence. "It's quite evident," Dick went on, after a long pause, "that he is a kind-hearted man, and that he objects altogether to Tippoo's cruelty to the prisoners. Therefore, if he had any captives, his reason for not answering was most likely a kindly one." "Yes, I should think so. You see, he would consider that he should report to the Sultan all particulars we had gathered about the fortress. His remarks about the execution of the prisoners, and the worthlessness of the Chelah battalions, and so on, that was a private conversation, and was only a matter of opinion. But supposing he had had some prisoners, and had said so, we might, for anything he knew, have had orders to inspect them, and to report about them, as well as about the garrisons and defences." "Yes, he might have thought that," Surajah agreed. "But after all, why should he mind that?" Dick did not answer for some time. He was trying to think it out. Presently, he reined in his horse suddenly. "This might be the reason," he said excitedly. "This governor may be the very one who we heard had taken my father with him, when he was moved from that fort up in the north. He was in command at Kisnagari before he came here, after the war, and he may have gone to Kisnagari from that fort in the north. You see, there have been executions, but there have been those of fresh batches sent up, and the governor would not include the captive he had brought with him. In time, his very existence may have been forgotten, and he may still be living there. That could account for the governor's objection to answer the question, as he would be sure that, did Tippoo hear there was a prisoner here, he would send orders for him to be executed at once. This may be all fancy, Surajah, but I cannot think of any other reason why he should have shirked my question." Dick took up the reins again, and the horses at once started forward. They rode for some little time in silence, Dick thinking the matter over again and again, and becoming more and more convinced he was right. Except that, as he admitted to himself, the prisoner whom the governor wished to shield might not be his father. He was roused at last by Surajah asking the question, "Is there anything that you would like us to do?" "Not now," Dick replied. "We could not go back again. We must visit the other forts on our list, and see what we can find out there. When we have quite assured ourselves that my father is not in any of them, we can think this over again. but at present we must put it aside. However, I shan't rest until I get to the bottom of it." During the next 10 days they inspected the forts of Navandrug, Sundradrug, Outradrug, and Chitteldrug. Few of these were as extensive and none so strong as Savandrug. They did the official part of their business, and assured themselves that no English captives were contained in any of them. The governors all said that prisoners were never kept there many days, and that it was only when Tippoo wished to get rid of them that they were sent there. None of the governors made any objection to answering Dick's questions on the subject, generally adding an expression of satisfaction that prisoners were never left long under their charge. "It entails a lot of trouble," the governor of Outradrug said. "They have to be watched incessantly, and one never feels certain they may not slip away. Look at this place. You would think that no one could make his escape, and yet some 10 years ago 14 of them got away from here. They slid down a precipice where no one would have thought a human being could have gotten down alive. They were all of them retaken except one, and executed the following day, but the Sultan was so furious that, although it was no fault of the governor, who had sentries placed everywhere, he sent for him to Seringapatam and threw him to the tigers, declaring that there must have been treachery at work. You may be sure that I have no desire to hold English prisoners after that, and when they have been sent here have been glad indeed when orders came for their execution. A good many were ordered to be starved to death, but I never waited for that. It took too long. Do what I could, the guards would smuggle in pieces of bread, and they lingered on for weeks, so that it was more merciful to finish with them at once, besides making me feel comfortable at the knowledge that there was no chance of their making their escape. There were sentries at their doors as well as on the walls when the 14 I have told you about escaped, but they dug a passage out at the back of their hut. Chose a very dark night, and it was only when the sound of some stones that they dislodged as they scrambled down the precipice gave the alarm to the sentries that their escape was discovered. No, I do not want any prisoners up here, and when they do come there is no sleep for me until I get the order to execute them. But they do not often come now. Most of the prisoners who were not given up have been killed since, and there are not many of them left." Upon finishing their round they returned to Seringapatam, where Dick drew up a full report of the result of their investigations. The Sultan himself went through it with them, questioning them closely, cut off a good many of the items, and gave orders that the other demands should be complied with, and the guns and ammunition sent off at once to the various forts from the great arsenal at the capital. Dick was depressed at the result of their journey. His hopes had fallen lower and lower as, at each fort they visited, he heard the same story, that all prisoners sent up to the mountain fortresses had in a short time been put to death. It was possible, of course, that his father might still be at one of the towns where new levies had been drilled, but he had not from the first thought it likely that a merchant sailor would be put to this work, and had it not been that he clung to the belief that there was a prisoner at Savandrug, and that the prisoner was his father, he would have begun to despair. It was true that there were still many hill forts scattered about the country, unvisited, but there seemed no reason why any of the prisoners should have been allowed to survive in these forts, when they had all been put to death in those they had visited, among which were the places that had been most used as prisons. "I would give it up," he said to Surajah, "were it not that, in the first place, it would almost break my mother's heart. Her conviction that my father is still alive has never been shaken. It has supported her all these years, and I believe that, were I to return and tell her that it was no longer possible to hope, her faith would still be unshaken. She would still think of him as pining in some dungeon, and would consider that I had given up the search out of faint-heartedness. That is my chief reason, but I own that I am almost as much influenced by my own conviction that he is in Savandrug. I quite admit that I can give no reason whatever why. If there is a prisoner there at all, it should be my father, and yet I cannot get it out of my mind that it is he. I suppose it is because I have the conviction that I believe in it. Why should I have that impression so strongly if it were not a true one? I tell myself that this is of course absurd, that I have no real grounds to go upon, and yet that does not shake my faith in the slightest. It's perhaps because we have been so fortunate. Altogether, everything has turned out so favourably that I can't help thinking he is alive, and that I shall find him. What do you think, Surajah? Ought we to give it up?" "Why should we?" said Surajah, replied stoutly. "I think you are right, and that we are destined to find your father. There is no hurry. We have not been anything like so long a time as we expected to be, and fortune has, as you say, befriended us wonderfully. We are well off here. We have positions of honour. For myself, I could wish for nothing better." "Well, at any rate, we will wait for a time," Dick said. "We may be sent to Savandroog again, and if so, I will not leave the place until I find out from the governor whether he has still a prisoner, and if so, manage to obtain a sight of him." The next day, Dick was informed by the chamberlain that the officer who was in charge of the wild beasts had fallen into disgrace, and that the sultan had appointed him to the charge. Dick was well pleased in some respects. The work would suit him much better than examining stores, and seeing that the servants of the Palace did their duty; but, on the other hand, it lessened his chance of being sent to Savandroog again. However, there was no choice in the matter, and Surajah cheered him by saying: "You must not mind, Dick. Has not everything turned out for the best? And you may be sure that this will turn out so also." It was, indeed, but 2 days later that Dick congratulated himself upon the change, for Surajah was sent by Tippoo with an order for the execution of 4 English prisoners. Dick knew nothing of the matter until Surajah, on his return, told him that he had been obliged to stop and see the orders carried out, by poison being forced down the unfortunate officers' throats. "It was horrible," he said, with tears in his eyes. "Horrible," Dick repeated. "Thank God I have been put to other work, for I feel that I could not have done it. And yet to have refused to carry out the tyrant's orders would have meant death to us both, while it would not have saved the lives of these poor fellows. Anyway, I would not have done it. As soon as I had received the order I would have come to you, and we would have mounted and ridden off together and taken our chance." "Let us talk of something else," Surajah said. "Are the beasts all in good health?" Well as they can be, when they are fed so badly and so miserably cooped up. I made a great row this morning, and have kept the men at work all day in cleaning out the places. They were all in a horrible state, and before I could get the work done, I had to threaten to report the whole of them to Tippoo, and they knew what would come of that. I told Fazli last night that the beasts must have more flesh, and got an order from him that all the bones from the kitchen should be given to them. That evening, when Dick, on his way to the apartments of one of the officers, was going along a corridor that skirted the portion of the Palace occupied by the zenana, a figure came out suddenly from behind the drapery of a door, dropped on her knees beside him, and, seizing his hand, pressed it to her forehead. It was, to all appearances, an Indian girl in the dress of one of the attendants of the zenana. "What is it, child?" he said. "You must have mistaken me for someone else." "No, Bahador, it is yourself I wanted to thank. One of the other attendants saw you go along this corridor some time ago, and ever since I have watched here of an evening, whenever I could get away unobserved, in hope of seeing you. It was I, my lord, whom the tiger was standing over when you came to our rescue. I was not greatly hurt, for I was pushed down when the tiger burst in, and save that it seized me with one of its paws and tore my shoulder, I was unhurt. Ever since, I have been hoping that the time would come when I could thank you for saving my life." "I am glad to have done so, child, but you had best retire into the zenana. It would not be good for you or me were I found talking to you." The girl rose to her feet submissively, and he now saw her face, which, in the dim light that burnt in the corridor, he had not hitherto noticed. "Why," he exclaimed with a start, "you are English!" "Yes, Sahib. I was brought here 8 years ago. I am 14 now. There were other English girls here then, but they were all older than me, and have been given away to officers of the sultan. I am afraid I shall be, too, ere long. I have dreaded it so much. But, oh, Sahib, you are a favourite of the sultan. If he would but give me to you, I should not mind so much." Dick was about to reply, when he heard a distant footfall. "Go in," he exclaimed. "Someone is coming. I will speak to you again, in a day or two." When he returned to his room, he told Surajah what had happened. "It will, at any rate, give me a fresh interest here," he said. "It is terrible to think that a young English girl should be in Tippoo's power, and that he can give her, whenever he likes, to one of his creatures. Of course, according to our English notions, she is still but a young girl, but as your people out here marry when the girls are but of the age of this child, it is different altogether." "She does not suspect that you are English?" "No. As I told you, I had only just discovered that she was so, when I heard a footstep in the distance. But I shall see her again, tomorrow or the next day." "You will be running a great risk," Surajah said gravely. "Oh, not much risk, I think," Dick replied. "She is only a little slave girl, and as the tiger was standing over her when I fired, no doubt I did save her life, and it would be natural enough that she would, on meeting me, speak to me and express her thanks." "That would be a good excuse," Surajah agreed; "but a suspicious tyrant like Tippoo might well insist that this was only a pretence, and that the girl was really giving you a letter or message from one of the inmates of the zenana." Dick was silent for a time. "I will be very careful," he said. "I must certainly see her again, and it seems to me, at present, that whatever risk there may be, I must try to save this poor girl from the fate that awaits her. I cannot conceal from myself that, however much I may refuse to admit it, the hopes of my finding and saving my father are faint indeed, and although this girl is nothing to me, I should feel that my mission had not been an entire failure if we could take her home with us, and restore her to her friends. "No, I don't think," he went on, in answer to a grave shake of Surajah's head, "that it would add to our danger in getting away. We know that, if we try to escape, and are caught, our lives will be forfeit in any case; and if she were disguised as a boy, we could travel with her without attracting any more observation than we should alone. She would not be missed for hours after she had left, and there would be no reason, whatever, for connecting her departure with ours. I don't say, Surajah, that I have made up my mind about it. Of course, it has all come fresh to me, and I really have not had time to think it over in any way. Still, it does seem to me that, when the time for our leaving comes, whether we ride off openly as Tippoo's officers, or whether we go off in disguise, there ought to be no very great difficulty in taking her with us. You see that yourself, don't you?" "I can't give any opinion about it, at present," Surajah replied. "I do think that it will add to our difficulties, however we may go, but I don't say it cannot be managed." "Oh, I should think not, Surajah, and it would be worth doing, however great the difficulties might be. Just think of the grief that her parents must feel, at her loss, and the joy when she is restored to them. You see, it would be no great loss of time, if we were obliged to take her down to Tripataly first, and then come back again to renew our search. It would take but a week going and returning, and now that the passes are all open to us, the difficulties would be nothing to what they were when we went back after our scouting expedition. Besides, at that time they were more vigilant, all along the frontier, than they will be now, because there was war between the two countries, and Tippoo was anxious that no news of his movements should be taken down. There is no talk of war now, for though Tippoo makes no disguise of his fury at his losses, especially at Coorg being taken from him, and is evidently bent upon fighting again, it will take a very long time to get his army into an efficient state, to repair his fortresses, to complete all the new works of defence he is getting up here, and to restore the confidence of his soldiers. I should think it will be fully 4 or 5 years before he is ready to fight again. At any rate, if we once get well away from here with the girl, we ought to have no difficulty in getting across the frontier. It would mean but a fortnight lost in the search for my father, and anyhow, we are not making any progress that way as long as we stop here. The only drawback would be, as far as I can see, that we should lose the benefit of our official positions, but unless we happen to be sent off with orders to other hill forts, that position will only hamper our movements. Besides, we should still have our badges of office, and Tippoo's official orders to the governors. Possibly the news that we had disappeared might reach the governors of some of the forts in this neighbourhood, but it would not be likely to travel very far. His officers so frequently fall into disgrace, and are either killed or thrown to the tigers, that the fact of our being missing would scarcely excite a remark, and those who heard of it would suppose that we had either been secretly made away with, or that, having learned that Tippoo was displeased with us, we had fled." Surajah nodded. His confidence in his leader was complete, and he was always ready to follow unquestioningly. "There is one thing, Surajah," Dick concluded. "This state of things cannot last much longer, anyhow, for next time it might be me he ordered to see to the execution of an English prisoner, and that would mean that I should, as soon as I received the command, make a bolt for it. So you see, our stay here, in any case, may not last many days. I would rather run any risks than carry out such an order." 2 evenings later, Dick went down the corridor at the same hour as that on which he had before met the English girl. She came out from behind the hangings at once when he passed. "I knew you would come, Bahador," she said joyfully. "I could see that you were as kind as you were brave, and would have pity upon a poor little white slave." "I have much that I want to say to you, child. This is not a good place for speaking. Someone might come along at any moment. How long can you be away without fear of your absence being noticed?" "Not long now," she said. "In the morning I am sent out on messages, and could meet you anywhere." "Very well. I will remain in my room all the morning tomorrow, and if you do not come, then I will stay in next day." "I will come," the girl said unhesitatingly. He then gave her full instructions how to find his room, and made her repeat them to him, in order to be sure that she had them correctly. "Do you know my companion at sight?" he asked. "Oh, yes, I have seen him often." "Well, either he or I will be standing at my door. It is well that you should look carefully round before you enter, so as to be sure there is no one in the corridor, and that you can slip in unobserved. You may be sure that I am asking you to come for no idle freak, but because I have something very important to say to you. Oh, I fancy I hear footsteps. Good night." Dick was sure that he and Surajah would both be at liberty next day, for Tippoo had that morning started for Bangalore, where a large number of men were at work repairing the fortifications, and removing all signs of the British occupation from the fort and palace. He was likely to be away for at least a fortnight. As soon as Ibrahim had swept the room after their early breakfast, Dick gave him a number of small commissions to be executed in the town, and told him that he should not require him again until it was time to bring up their meal from the kitchen. Then he and Surajah by turns watched at the door. An hour later Surajah, who was upon the watch, said, "The girl is coming." There was no one else in sight, and when Surajah beckoned to her she hurried on, and passing through the curtains at the door entered the room. It had been arranged that Surajah should remain on watch, so that should by any chance one of the officials of their acquaintance come along, he might go out and talk with him in the corridor, and on some excuse or other prevent his entering the room, if he showed any intention of doing so. "Now, in the first place," Dick said, as he led the girl to the divan and seated her there, "what is your name?" "My name is Goorla." "No, I mean your proper name." "My name used to be Annie Mansfield, Bahadur." "And my name is Dick Holland," he said in English. She gave a start of surprise. "Yes, Annie, I am a countryman of yours." She looked at him almost incredulously, and then an expression of aversion succeeded that of confidence in her face. She sprang from the divan and drew herself up in dignity. "Please let me go," she said haughtily. "You have saved my life, but if you had saved it 20 times, I could not like a man who is a deserter." Dick had at first been speechless with astonishment at the girl's change of manner, and at her reception of the news he had thought would have been very pleasant to her. As her last words threw a light upon the matter, he burst into a merry laugh. "I am no deserter, Annie, save my friend at the door and yourself. There is no one here who knows that I am English. Sit down again, and I will tell you how I came to be here. My father was the captain of an English ship. She was wrecked on the west coast, and he was seized and brought up here a prisoner 8 years ago. My mother, who was a daughter of the late Rajah of Tripatli, who married an English lady, taught me to speak Hindustani, so that when I got old enough I could come out here and try to find out if my father was still alive, and if so, to help him escape. I had only just come up here with my friend, who is an officer of the Rajah's, when that affair with the tiger took place. Then, as you know, Tippoo made us both officers in the palace. Of course, while we are here, we can do nothing toward finding out about my father, and we should not have remained here much longer anyway, and may have to leave at any moment. Since you met me, and I found out that there was an English girl captive here, it has, of course, changed my plans, and I feel that I could not go away and leave you to the fate you told me of, and that, if possible, I must take you away with me. That is, of course, if you are willing to go with us, and prepared to run a certain amount of risk. Do not take on so," he continued, as the girl threw herself on her knees, and, clinging to him, burst into a passion of tears. "Do not cry like that," and, stooping down, he lifted her and placed her in a corner of the divan. "There," he said, patting her on the shoulder, as she sobbed almost convulsively. "Try and compose yourself. We may be disturbed at any moment, and may not have an opportunity of talking again, so we must make our arrangements in readiness to leave suddenly. I may find it necessary to go at an hour's notice. You may, as you said, be given by Tippoo to one of his favourites at any time. Fortunately, he has gone away for a fortnight, so we have, at any rate, that time before us to make our plans. Still, it is better that we should arrange now as much as we can."